Just to get us started this morning, I've got a question for you all. What is your relationship with rules like? So I would want to sort of say, in my opinion, rules can be a good thing. Rules are put in place for a reason, and I think primarily to maintain peace and harmony in the society. And rules tend to become an impediment to that peace and harmony when when one group of people in the society seem to benefit more than others because of those rules. If you think back 4 years ago, here in South Africa, or the world over, we were in the peak of a pandemic. Our memories are short, eh? And we had some rules that were put in place. They were even gazetted into law. Do you remember we could not buy flip-flops? And worse still, that loved rotisserie chicken. It was taken off the shelves because for some reason or another, a group of very clever people thought it would spread the virus. I'm waiting for that day when I can have a coffee with one of those people and say, please explain to me how you came up with these rules. There was a gentleman who was a fighter pilot in World War I, and he was a bit of a rebel against rules. His name was Harry Day. He was a British fighter pilot, and he coined this phrase, that rules are for the abeyance of fools and the guidance of the wise. So I don't know, use it, don't use it. I also have a short story to share with you this morning about rules. So my family and I, a little over, let's say 10 years ago, we traveled home to Zim by road, and we were on our way back at the Beitbridge border post, coming back into South Africa. And my wife, Lynn, had a conversation with one of the immigration officials at the desk. And so our children were still much younger then. And the lady says to Lynn, where are the birth certificates for the kids? And Lynn is like, well, we only traveled with passports because that's what you need to cross the border. And the birth certificates are at home. And she said, well, we need to see the birth certificates. Lynn is like, why? And she responds and says, this is the border post. The rules change every day. So you've got a fairly good idea of where I stand on my relationship with rules. Suffice to say, Lynn, being the more organized party in our family, now has a whole file that she has labeled the fire file. And in that file is every document you can think of, from passports to birth certificates. Even our marriage certificate sits in that file. So everywhere we go, whenever we need to travel, we always take that file with us because we don't know when the rules are going to change again. Let's turn our Bibles to the book of Matthew in chapter 5. This morning I'm reading from verse 17 to 20. Jesus says, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. The title of my message today is Don't Throw the Baby Out with the Bathwater. And this idiom is a warning not to lose something good or valuable in your attempt to get rid of what is unwanted. Jesus is speaking to the Jewish people who are living under Roman occupation and oppression. The religious leaders of the time, who are the scribes and the Pharisees, have turned the laws into a confusing mass of rules that were very difficult to keep pace with. And it is into this story that Jesus is sharing the Sermon on the Mount, and he is very confidently saying he has not come to abolish the rules, but instead he has come to fulfill them. From this passage of Scripture, I want to highlight three main themes that I think are important for us to see. The first is that Jesus is the new Moses. The second one is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophet's expectations. And lastly, Jesus is wisdom personified. Saying that Jesus is the new Moses, in verse 17, Jesus says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And the law that Jesus is talking about here is the Torah. The Torah is a Hebrew word meaning to instruct, and it represents the first 5 chapters of the Hebrew Bible, or what we call the Old Testament. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And in some instances, perhaps different Bible translations, you will find the Torah being called the law of Moses, because Moses was the chosen prophet by God, whose primary task was to rescue the Israelite people out of Egypt and take them across into the promised land. So in the Old Testament, we realize that this law was divided into 3 broad categories. You had what was called the ceremonial law. These laws related specifically to the manner in which the Israelites were to worship God. And the ceremonial laws were also related to the proper way in which sacrifices, rituals, the celebration of festivals, that's what they determined. We also then had a second group of laws called the civil laws, and these related to how people related to each other on a day-to-day basis. Things like marriage, divorce, sexual conduct, ownership of property, and those sorts of things. And then the last group was the moral laws. So this was the direct command of God, and it reflected God's holy and unchanging character. The 10 Commandments, as we know them today, actually fall under the moral laws, and they required strict obedience. We know that Moses received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. If you go read up on that in Exodus chapter 20. The Torah contained over 600 laws. That's a lot of laws, 613 to be exact. And we know that the Pharisees and the religious teachers at the time had, because they felt they were holier than thou and high and mighty, had added to the Torah. So in addition to observing these laws, they had added on other things. So you can understand how pensive that group of people that Jesus is speaking to at that time, because here's a man coming to tell them that over and above these 600,000 laws, he's not coming to abolish them, but he instead is coming to fulfill them. So like Moses, Jesus is not only coming to rescue Israel, but he's coming to rescue all of humanity. Because Israel was the chosen group of people by God. Because these were the people that God had chosen to say, when heaven and earth are going to unite, I am going to fulfill my purpose through these people. Jesus is a greater Moses who views the scriptures as something that points forward, a set of texts that create momentum instead of holding the people back. He provides the resolution to which the Torah and the prophets are pointing to. Last week, Dave spoke about salt and light, and we heard that the salt and being salt and light in the world relates to our potential, our innate, incredible potential that each of us have. So Jesus is giving the Israelites this push to say, be the salt and the light. Do not let the law be the impediment of what it is God has called you to become. Jesus is also the fulfillment of the prophet's expectations. In verse 18, he says, "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." Jesus took the Torah very seriously. When we go back to the beginning of the Bible, the first book of the Bible, Genesis, the first words, Genesis 1 verse 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And everything after that, we're told that God spoke things into being. He created day and night. He created the rivers, the oceans, the mountains, the valleys. All of that was spoken into existence. The Torah is actually the inspired words of God, what the Israelites called wisdom literature. Jesus, in his wisdom, is emphasizing the fact that because everything that we know here on earth and in heaven was created by God and it was spoken into existence, it therefore means that the words that are in the Torah are actually from God. Therefore, they are eternal and they will endure forever. He then uses another idiom, which says, the smallest letter and stroke, least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So these things, in some Bible translations, I think the ESV they call it a jot and a tittle. These are elements of the Hebrew alphabet, which, when omitted from a particular word or sentence construction, will change the meaning of that. And Jesus is saying, even those things will not be taken out of the law because everything in the Torah is important. So much like us who use the English language for communication, when we don't dot our I's and cross our T's, the meaning of words can become completely different. Jesus also fulfills the expectations of all the prophets. So if you read on in the Old Testament, we've got writings of people like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. These were all prophets. When Israel rebelled against God, God's plan for rescuing humanity did not change. He continued to speak through the prophets. And they all have writings where they are pointing to one who was to come, who was going to fulfill the plans and purposes of God. And Jesus is that expectation. He fulfills the law and the prophets in their entirety. Jesus is also wisdom personified. He himself is wisdom. The last two verses, he says, therefore anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So it's quite clear from verse 19 that within that society, there was a realization that, yes, the Torah was this huge list of commands. One, those commands were not easy to honor. And the second point is that there were some commands or laws that appeared to have less weighting than others. And Jesus, once again, he's saying to these people that every law is important. I've come to fulfill every law. So by breaking a lesser law, don't think you're going to get away with it. Every law is important in the Torah. Jesus then takes things up to a higher level. He now talks about us needing to have a righteousness that surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Jesus is flipping the social order once again. Like I said earlier, the Pharisees and the religious scribes at the time, because they had the authority in teaching the Torah, they felt like they were the most important people. But Jesus is saying, yes, they may have authority in the society at present, but are they righteous? So if your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, you will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So the order changes. The first becomes last and the last becomes first. Over the last few weeks, we have learned that the word righteousness comes from the Greek word dikaisune. Righteousness means living in right relationship or right standing with God, with other people, and all of creation. This means that we must live justly, we must live honestly, we must live faithfully according to God's instructions. And there's some practical ways in which we can express our righteousness. Not limited to prayer, to fasting, to giving generously to the poor, forgiving others, and loving our enemies. In the weeks ahead, we are going to see how Jesus further breaks these things down in all his teachings. The foundation of all the teachings that he speaks about in the Sermon on the Mount is righteousness. So, to live the way that Jesus is talking about is to do right by God. Jesus claims that the Torah and the prophets point to an even more radical behavior change that is rooted in the transformation of our hearts. Righteousness is a posture of the heart. And then much later on in Matthew's gospel, Jesus even takes things to a much higher level. He illustrates what the highest standard of living that fulfills the Torah and the prophets actually is. He is challenged by one of the religious teachers in Matthew 22 from verse 34. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest command in the law?" And Jesus replies, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." And then he gives him a bonus commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. And then he concludes by saying, all the law and prophets hang on these two commandments. Won't you stand? So when we read further in the New Testament, especially when we look at the writings of Paul, he also has the same emphasis of what it actually means to fulfill the law. In Romans 13, verse 10, he says, "Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." In Galatians 5, verse 14, he says, "For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself." So righteousness is a posture of the heart. And in order to be righteous, you need to love God and love people. So living God's way means you love God and you love people, and you're empowered by the Spirit. You're not hamstrung by needing to follow a set of rules and doctrines, but it's the posture of your heart. Our mission here at Free Church is that we inspire people to follow Jesus and to live in freedom and with purpose. Freedom means that you are working out the salvation that Jesus has earned for you. And you are fulfilling the God-given purpose that He has for your life. So this morning, I don't want you to miss the opportunity. If you do not know Jesus, if you do not have a personal relationship with Jesus, please don't leave here this morning, because that is the only way that you'll be able to experience what righteousness is. And secondly, I also want to give you a chance to do right by the other people that you know that are in this room. as we'll close off the meeting, there's communion tables laid out at the back. Won't you share communion with somebody? Because that is what Jesus is asking us to do. He's asking us to live righteously. And he fulfilled the law so we do not have to be hamstrung by all these rules and regulations, but with a posture in our hearts of loving God and loving other people. My last question to you is, what is the level of your righteousness meter?